Okay, good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lydia, and I'm the Deputy Director of Events for the Harvard Extension Student International Relations Club. And I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy evening to join us. The Harvard Extension Student International Relations Club is pleased to bring this event to you today and for you to meet our incredible guest, Dr. Danilo Mandic. However, before we jump into the main event, I would like to take a quick moment to speak to you about the Harvard Extension Student International Relations Club. HESIRC's mission is to build a global community of Harvard Extension International Relations students and to provide targeted opportunities for community building and academic and career development, complemented by what HES offers. Through moderated events with industry professionals, our club aims to create opportunities for HES-IR students and affiliates to engage in critical thought and dialogue outside of the classroom, providing a space for networking where students are able to connect with experts and colleagues across the world. If you are a current HES student, and especially if you're a current IR student, please consider joining our club. As a member, you will have access to a broader community of HES students in our WhatsApp chat, mailing list, and member events. And I'm going to go ahead and add the link to our membership application form in the chat box in a little while so that you can sign up and we can be sure to invite you to our future events and activities. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague in the Harvard Extension Student International Relations Club, our president, Alexandra Islas.
Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Alexandra Islas, and I'm the president of the HESIR Club. And we are so thrilled to welcome Dr. Danilo Mandic here for us today. Today, we will be discussing refugees, forced migration, and global perspective. But before we begin, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. This discussion is open to members of the public, as well as all Harvard affiliates and Harvard students. It will be recorded, and select portions of the interview will be put on our website and circulated on social media. This event will begin with about a 20 to 30 minute interview, and then we will stop the recording and open it up to a Q&A session for you. We please ask that you do remain muted during the duration of the interview portion, and we will make that announcement when we do turn the recording off. And at the end, we will ask you to enter your questions into the chat so that our colleague Lydia here can ask those questions to Dr. Mandic. And now, with much appreciation and excitement on behalf of the HESIRC, I am pleased to welcome and introduce the reason why we are all here today, Dr. Danilo Mandic. Dr. Mandic is an associate senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology at Harvard University, Center Associate for the Davis Center of Russian and Eurasian Studies, and faculty associate at the Minda D. Gutzberg Center for European Studies. His research focuses on war, refugees, social movements, nationalism, ethnic relations, organized crime, and conflict societies. He holds an A.B. from Princeton University and a Ph.D. from Harvard University. His book, Gangsters and Other Statesmen, received the Mirya Komorowski Best Book Award and the ASA Section on Peace and Social Conflicts Best Book Award in 2022. His book, The Syrian Refugee Crisis, is forthcoming in 2023. His work and commentary have appeared in Time Magazine, BBC, Vice News, and the Time Literary Supplement and other media. He has conducted fieldwork across West Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. And through his research and teaching, he seeks to direct undergraduates into work with refugees abroad. He is currently investigating internally displaced persons from the war in Ukraine, during which he conducted on-the-ground research near the front line. Welcome, Dr. Mandic. We are so thrilled to have you and thankful that you took the time to be with us here tonight.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. That's very kind of you, and it's a tremendous privilege to be here. And it's a tremendous privilege to teach at the Harvard Extension School, precisely because one gets to interact with students like Alexandra, so thank you so much. My understanding is that we have a very short time together, and the agreement we made is for me to not go on and on as I do in my refugee course. And I see several victims of that particular course here, so they know what I mean when I say I could go on and on. But since we don't have a lot of time, and since the organizers put a set of questions together that are really excellent, I'm going to try to just do two things to give you a kind of overview. I'm going to show you two things. One is going to be a map which summarizes some of the global dynamics. on forced migration as we see them today. And the second one is going to be an anecdote from the field in Ukraine from this summer, because I think it's just a couple of photos, and then we'll see how much time we have left. But let's start with that and see how it goes. So this is are you able to see the screen? I hope it's okay.
Yes.
And somebody will hopefully yell at me if the audio goes bad. So, when I began teaching the course that we used as a title here, Refugees, Forced Migration in a Global Perspective, which was at the peak of the Syrian refugee crisis in 2016, the global count of so-called persons of interest, as the UNHCR calls them, meaning forced migrants globally who are registered with the UNHCR as persons of interest, as somebody that they have a red flag about, that they would like to keep on the books because they fear for their safety or for their humanitarian conditions or for one or another reason. That number, this is considered a kind of gold standard number for the global situation, and they do this every year. They put out a number. In 2016, when I started teaching this, it was a number close to 55 million globally. Today, we're up to 100 million. I remember debating with students at the time, is it going to reach 60? Is it going to reach 65? Is it going to hit 70? We kind of had a little betting parlor going informally with the undergrads. And here we are 6-7 years later, and we are well over 100 million displaced persons in the world, according to the UNHCR. Some of that is overcounting, and some of that is the problem that we weren't counting well enough before, and we are getting better and better in counting, and that the UNHCR is being more inclusive. That accounts for some of that change in the number, but much of it is simply because indeed we have a tremendous displacement problem on our hands that young people who study IR need to pay special attention to. So this 100 million now that we've surpassed globally includes the vast majority of that is what we call internally displaced persons. Internally displaced persons are basically what we colloquially call refugees who have not crossed an international border, meaning they are displaced, they cannot, maybe from one or another form of violence, right? We're talking about people fleeing artillery shelling, people fleeing their house being burned down, people fleeing their livelihood is threatened because there's no water, there's no electricity, or there is death around them, or there is death threats to them, or, it takes 101 forms. But forced migrants are typically one or another kind of person who's fleeing from one or another kind of collective violence or persecution. And persecution is a key concept in the legal definition of a refugee, which we can perhaps return to in the Q&A. And so the vast majority of these 100 million that you're looking at are what we call IDPs. And then a small subset of them, a couple of dozen million, are what we call convention refugees, meaning people who crossed an international border. And the first thing to know is that the people who cross an international border, even though they are a minority, are disproportionately represented in our journalistic accounts, in our media accounts, in our pop culture understanding, in our scholarly understanding. The people who are arguably much more endangered and much more directly in risk of losing their lives or losing their well-being are not the ones who managed to flee an international border, but are those IDPs still stuck in the countries where they have been displaced. Crossing an international border and being a convention refugee requires a certain amount of resources. Not everybody is in a position to do that. Many people need, it's very expensive, for example, to flee from certain countries to get across borders because, for example, you have to pay smugglers, you have to have access to criminal service providers, and they are not cheap. Take it from me. I spent some time working and interviewing them for this book that Alexandra mentioned, and you can believe me when I tell you that it is very, very expensive to procure the services of a migrant or refugee smuggler. And so it also requires social capital to cross international borders. So if I have cousins or friends or acquaintances in Germany, it's a lot easier for me to get to Germany from, for example, Syria or from Afghanistan or from sub-Saharan Africa, even more so, if as opposed to if I don't know anybody in Germany, right? So the social capital is also very important. The financial resources are very important. And what that ends up meaning, if you think about it, is that refugees, meaning the ones who do cross an international border, who we pay disproportionate attention to are not a representative sample of the population that is endangered, right? They are in fact disproportionately well educated, disproportionately well off financially, economically, disproportionately high SES or socioeconomic status, and disproportionately high social capital. And this is important to remember because these are not the wretched of the earth that need our attention the most, arguably, because those people we don't even see. They're not even on our radar because they're IDPs and they're not, for example, in Poland where all the cameras are. And the second thing to note about that is that contrary to the kind of popular portrayal or caricature of refugees as pity cases and parasites and somebody in need of, humanitarian aid all the time, convention refugees are disproportionately high on human capital because they are so disproportionately educated, well off, and so on. This pool of people is a tremendous resource for the labor markets of the countries that they arrive to, for the technological innovation and entrepreneurship in the countries that they arrive to the education system, to say nothing of the cultural diversity, the cultural heterogeneity, the cultural entrepreneurship that they are potentially extraordinary contributors to in the societies that they go to, right? We don't often think of them that way, but we need to move towards a situation of thinking of them that way, including in bilateral relations between governments. So what you see on this map regarding those 100 million people who are displaced worldwide is that forced migration and refugees are not the proverbial first world problem. They are overwhelmingly the problem of what we call developing, poor, underdeveloped, what used to be called third world. Now we transcended this terminology, countries. This is important to keep in mind because the United States, Western Europe, Australia, Canada, those kinds of the fancy societies are often the ones screaming bloody murder over the so-called refugee crisis, the refugee drama, the refugee invasion, the influx of refugees, the volume is going up. Sometimes reading the newspapers, you would be forgiven for imagining that the advanced democracies, the advanced wealthy, fancy industrialized countries are the ones hosting refugees or forced migrants primarily. Nothing could be further from the case, right? So the vast majority of people never cross an international border, as we just said. And most of those who do, something between 85 to 90% of the people who cross an international border are in neighboring countries to the ones that they fled. So the curse of geography is very pronounced here. And it's a small subset of a subset of a subset of the overall forced migration catastrophe that ever reaches the United States, that ever reaches Western Europe, that ever reaches an advanced, wealthy economy with lots of labor opportunities, for example. And so this is overwhelmingly the burden, as they sometimes like to say, though I don't like to use this terminology, partly because refugee populations are an opportunity and not just some kind of burden. And for other reasons as well, we want to be careful with the terminology of burden sharing and burden of refugees and so on. But the point is that the overwhelming majority of the burden of refugee populations, hosting them, providing for them, integrating them, or failing to integrate them, as the case may be, the overwhelming majority of that burden is in poor, impoverished countries. Specifically, you want to look at Turkey. So Turkey, as you know, is right here in the Middle East and is bar none the single most important host country. If you look at the last, for example, 10, 15 years, and that's primarily because of the Syrian refugee crisis. So the Syrians, which you can see the numbers up here, are and have been for a great number of years since the Syrian civil war began slowly in 2011 and then escalating, especially 14, 15, 16. Syria has been the number one source country in the medium to long term for a very long time, for medium to long term at least. And the overwhelming majority of Syrians are in Turkey. Turkey has been, host country champion. And regardless of what we think of Erdogan's regime, about which we can talk about for sure, nobody has done more than Turkey in accommodating and integrating at some level, and with a million footnotes, millions of people. and a subset of them, some 300, 400,000, successfully surviving, at least, which is no small feat, in dozens of refugee camps across Turkey, in at least 10 cities. And the civilian and humanitarian infrastructure, which is not only built, of course, by Turks and by local Turkish and Kurdish workers, but is an international effort with thousands of volunteers coming from around the world. So one of the great untold stories of humanitarian refugee solidarity, success, and a spectacular kind of refugee solidarity movement, which is international in character. There's a tremendous story untold thus far about what Turkey has done since the Syrian civil war and what this refugee solidarity movement inside Turkey managed to do. We know many of the criticisms, but that is certainly something to keep an eye on. That's in absolute numbers. Turkey is the greatest host society for a great number of years. And then you can look at countries like Lebanon on a per capita basis and to begin to appreciate the demographic earthquake that taking refugees can mean for a small, impoverished Middle Eastern country like Lebanon, which has a great deal of instability, as you know, which has a very nasty post-colonial legacy, which has many liabilities. And yet Lebanon took something, depending on how you want to count the Palestinians, something like 30 to 45% of the population of Lebanon is refugees. Almost every second person on the territory of Lebanon is a refugee. It's impossible to understand Lebanese modern contemporary history without understanding refugees. And that's really a spectacular story as well. And then you could talk about Myanmar or Burma, you could talk about Bangladesh, you could talk about the millions of people who are going to continue to come into Bangladesh from places like Myanmar over the next decades that we are not very well prepared to absorb. This map, of course, what I've been talking about so far are forced migrants who are primarily fleeing violence. We haven't even gotten to the looming catastrophe over the next 30, 40, 50 years, as projected by World Bank or the United Nations, or you pick your favorite IR source. And the looming catastrophe is anthropogenic global warming is a reality. And the sea levels, it's enough for them to rise by the conservative estimates that are being put out in order for a place like Bangladesh that is very low level, topographic, very low level land close to the water, very low level, conservative estimates about water rise are enough for Bangladesh to be completely underwater in mid-century. What does that mean? That means that tens of millions of people are going to become what's called eco-refugees, meaning people not fleeing necessarily violence and war and persecution and ethnic cleansing, which has been the norm since the Second World War in the 20th century, certainly. We are now moving into a world where most refugees are not even necessarily going to be fleeing collective violence, but are going to be fleeing one or another version of the first and second order effects of climate change. And that is another thing we are woefully unprepared for. And the way to become prepared is to pay attention to this now so that we know, you can think of the Syrian refugee crisis that Alexandra was kind enough to mention. I have this book out called Syrian Refugee Crisis. The title is in the topic, really. And the topic is in the title. And, looking at that crisis might be a really good idea, even if you don't care about the Middle East, even if you don't care about war, even if you don't care about violence and collective violence. It might be a really good idea to study that crisis as a dress rehearsal for what you can expect when the eco-migration crisis hits, which invariably it will. It will hit in Sub-Saharan Africa, it will hit in the Middle East, it will certainly hit very hard in Southeast Asia, and it already is hitting. Yeah, we shouldn't say nobody warned us. You really shouldn't say nobody warned. So obviously this has a lot of implications for international relations, which we can perhaps return to, but let me just point out one thing before I move to my next slide regarding how nation state sovereignty today relates to this problem. And that is to say that the big lie about refugees that is often allowed to propagate in pop culture, and in my view in a lot of the scholarship as well, unfortunately, is that refugee crises are kind of unfortunate tragedies that happened almost accidentally and almost as a byproduct of some, unknown hidden forces out there. And why is that a lie? Because the countries that are purportedly presenting themselves as innocent bystanders, as good Samaritans, who out of the goodness of their heart and out of their altruism, for example, are intervening multilaterally, bilaterally, internationally, or unilaterally to support refugees. The typical framing is that they are doing it out of some kind of magnanimity, out of some altruism, and that the refugee crisis going on out there are kind of like elementary disasters or something, that the causes of those refugee waves have nothing to do with us. The fact of the matter is that refugee crises cannot be understood causally without reference to the fact that major players on the international scene, through their foreign policy, through their militarism, through their diplomatic efforts and failures to do things diplomatically, are the cause of these refugee crises. And I include in that the United States, of which I'm a naturalized citizen, thank you very much. And I include in that the Western European societies, right? And I include in that major, of course, regional powers like Russia and major emerging powers like China. The societies that are often the loudest in thumping their chest about the humanitarian efforts to alleviate refugee crises are often very reluctant to admit that refugee problems today are foreign policy problems, that you can't understand asylum today without addressing militarist intervention, including by governments who are often pretending as if they have nothing to do with it. And so this map is also worthwhile thinking about in the context of certainly Ukraine. That's an obvious one. Russian aggression in Ukraine, as you know, in recent months has broken several records and precedents in forced migration since the Second World War. And I'll show you an example of one refugee testimonial. But looking at the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, and the disaster that is the aftermath of the 2011 bombing of Libya. And you could go on and you could go on, right? A lot of the discussion is left unsatisfactory on the refugee question, because without addressing the root causes, we are only putting a Band-Aid on the open wound, and we are talking about treating symptoms as opposed to talking about how these refugees did not fall out of the clear blue sky. Syria, that I mentioned, is impossible to understand without a kind of international coalition, which includes, Iran and its proxy terror war in Syria, and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and what Turkey was doing vis-a-vis al-Nusra Front in Syria is a big piece of the story of why that crisis spiraled out of control and why that civil war escalated. And it includes the Obama administration's interventionist politics through particularly the John Kerry period inside Syria, when the US government is supporting moderate terrorists at the expense of extremist terrorists and other such, sending weapons to various rebel factions and so on, right? So instead of talking about something like the Syrian refugee crisis in a vacuum and the advanced industrial democracies as coming in to save, like a white horse on a white knight on a horse after the catastrophe has already happened, we need to move to a more analytic understanding that in the very causes, right, in the contextual causal story of where these refugee crises happen and why they magnify, why they erupt when they do, we have to put foreign policy and militarism and the diplomacy at the center of the story and begin to understand that in IR, there is an awful lot of discussion about what would be a good policy vis-a-vis Russia, what would be a good policy in the Congo, what would be, with remarkably little understanding of the human cost in terms of displacement and in terms of mass migration and in terms of, right, it's one thing to talk about casualties and people who get slaughtered and, for example, ethnically cleansed. That's kind of the core of victimhood and suffering in conflict zones and post-conflict zones. But we want to understand, I hope I've convinced you, that there's a kind of first concentric circle around that called IDPs, who are far more numerous and whose lives are a burning humanitarian problem often, and who are trapped. You know, many of the IDPs you speak to say things like, I wish I had died, because what they are trapped in is in many real significant ways worse than death. And so those people are not on our radar, not on our agenda when we write the foreign policy memos and pitch them, whether it's at the Kennedy School or in the State Department or in think tanks or in the journalism op-ed pages, wherever it may be. It is very, very easy to be courageous and militarist and hawkish in the op-ed pages of a newspaper. But if we, in the course of doing that, we need to consider the collateral damage, if you want to use that awful euphemism, in the sense of displacement, right? So around the casualties, there are IDPs, and around those IDPs, there are refugees. And around those refugees in the final concentric circle is a small sliver, a subset of a subset of a subset of the overall forced migrant population who enter, for example, the United States or enter Canada, and that those are the people that we will tend to encounter. And we need to remember that those are the tip of the iceberg. Right? Let me now just spend another 10, maybe 5 minutes just showing you. This is a underground bunker in Ukraine that I interviewed many people with this summer in the war zone. And these people, I won't show you their faces, but this is a moment captured on photography after they spent 2 months and 3 weeks sleeping underground. So these people had just spent close to 3 months living here in places like this to hide from Russian bombardment, sleeping underground in the so-called Central Market subway station in Kharkiv, or Kharkov as the Russian called it. This is Ukraine's second largest city. These people were considered stubborn, so hundreds of other displaced families had decided to give up on life beneath the ground after the first few weeks of Russian invasion. But these people, mostly old age pensioners, mostly women, mostly children, there were some cats down there. There was even a rabbit down there, right? Many of them had not seen sunlight for months. Many of them were in diapers, no water, no electricity down there. And when one of the women we spoke to first refused to leave her house, but then when the bombardment escalates, everything in the Kharkiv started to light up. It was incessant artillery. It was called Grad. And I remember one phrase somebody used: the sky turned red, and also the skies turned red from the incessant aerial strikes, and the streets turned red with blood because there were corpses beginning to everywhere. And on television, you're looking at the corpses on those occasions when you have the television. Clinics start burning like matches from bombing. Schools, markets, residential buildings, civilian structures, they all start burning like matches. The ground would shake. And slowly people would decide to move into a situation like this and decide to live underground like this for a very long time. And what was amazing about their reemergence was that it wasn't entirely even voluntary. It was an act of by the municipal authorities in Kharkiv to send a message: we pushed the Russians back. Everything's back to normal now. Everything's back to normal. And so they were evacuating them, even though they didn't want to leave, for the purpose of sending a message. The metro has to reopen, and they have to send in these sanitation crews to start cleaning up everything down there. And cleaning up everything down there is no easy task. No easy task at all, because this was closed from February until about late April, May, when we saw them, and now it has to be reopened immediately. Down there was an underground refugee camp, very sizable, right? It was a veritable refugee camp underground, which included tents and hamlets and toilets and kitchens and libraries, improvised libraries and improvised gyms and barricades and barbed wire fences, barbed wire fortifications, because they were preparing for Russian invaders to come down there, and they were prepared for street fighting possibility in the underground. And littered around them were, all kinds of basic goods. So people would go down there to look at this like a zoo. And what was extraordinary, and many things were extraordinary about this that I don't have time to go into, but you know, these kinds of people will never appear in any, you know, public. It's very difficult to understand that most forced migrants are like this. They're in some godforsaken, invisible hamlet, and there is no state presence. There is no formal regulated, you know, but it's an impromptu, bottom-up, improvised, unregulated, refugee-created refugee camp, as opposed to the refugee camps that we tend to pay attention to, which are the ones that are top-down, that are government bureaucracy mandated, that appear on the ministries of the countries you may be interested in. You go to the ministry and they say, these are the refugee camps that are formal government-operated refugee camps that are regulated. But we need to understand that that, again, is just the tip of the iceberg, because you have millions upon millions of people inside Ukraine, to speak nothing of the DRC or Bangladesh, or we can go back to the map and talk. I know some of you are interested in some regions more than others. This is literally the tip of the iceberg, and that underneath that we have tens upon tens of millions of people who are invisible to us. And we need to think together, both as states and students and academics. Policymakers need to think a lot more with the scholars as to how to understand this better and how to penetrate these zones, which are extremely, of course, impenetrable, and access is very difficult. And there is a kind of epistemic blockage between us and them in our understanding of forced migrants. So I have other photos. Maybe I can leave you with one more, which I like, which is this from the Syrian refugee crisis. And maybe now we can turn to some questions, and we will see how I can sneak in some of my other slides that way. Thank you for your attention.
And if you have more to share, please feel free to continue, or I can ask a couple of questions, but I definitely want you to be able to share if you have some prepared.
Better we move to the audience questions to make sure so I have way too much to share.
Okay, I think just one question that really impacted me that I would like for you to speak on a little bit is the concept of non-arrival policies, and the fact that states often accept refugees in name only, while also creating these elaborate non-arrival policies from preventing them from even stepping foot on their soil. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So non-arrival policy is not a concept of mine. It's a concept of a very prominent refugee scholar called Gibney, Alex Gibney. And he coined the phrase non-arrival policy to describe a pattern of behavior by a lot of governments as regards border restrictionism, and as impacts asylum seekers in particular, impacts forced migrants in particular. And the pattern is that even though nominally most governments in the world have signed the Refugee Convention, this main document that regulates asylum rights as basic human rights after the World War II. There's the 1967 protocol, which is an addendum to the Refugee Convention, but basically the Refugee Convention and the protocol are the main framework, legally speaking, defining obligations that states have to refugees. And without going into too much detail, we will have to recognize that this framework has, although it's a tremendous asset, and although thank God we have the Refugee Convention, and thank God that many governments have signed it, although not all governments have signed it, including the countries that are some of the biggest host societies in the world, including several that I mentioned in the Middle East, are not signatories to the Refugee Convention, nor could they be realistically, because practically, feasibly, it is not implementable for such a large population, given how structurally weak these countries are, right? So we have a lot to go. But one of the patterns that emerged that non-arrival policies captures is that governments, even though nominally are signatories to the convention, and even though they nominally adhere to the international law, and even though nominally they are prepared to deliver rights to asylum seekers and refugees, bypass their obligations by implementing all kinds of preemptive measures designed to prevent potential asylum seekers from entering sovereign territory. Some of these preemptive measures, some of these non-arrival policies are, particular kinds of visas, and those are kind of the obvious trivial ones. But then there are these more sophisticated ones, which many refugee scholars find problematic, such as, for example, penalizing travel agencies and private sector actors who do transportation and making them stakeholders in one way or another in blocking potential asylum seekers from coming into your country. And the reason coming into your country is so important is because that activates the Refugee Convention. The United States, for example, has no obligations at all until they enter American sovereign territory, in which case we do have the activation of their asylum rights. And that doesn't mean anyone is entitled to refugee status. Nobody is entitled to refugee status under the Refugee Convention, unless governments would like to do that as a prerogative, as a privilege of theirs. It's not an obligation of any government to give refugee status, but there are certain protections, including basic things like protection from torture and protection and due process and various other things that come along with the Refugee Convention. The most important one being non-refoulement, this principle that they cannot be returned, they cannot be deported back to the country that is persecuting them, back to the place where their lives are in danger. That's an important deliverable of the Refugee Convention. But in order to activate it, you need to reach American territory. You need to actually set foot on national sovereign territory of whatever the host country could potentially be. The worst non-arrival policy of all, right? So I mentioned things like visas, I mentioned things like penalizing private sector actors. The worst non-arrival policy of all is interdiction. That is to say, and this is a picture of the Syrian refugee crisis in the Mediterranean. And many of you may remember that the EU, through Frontex and through various other actors, coordinated a very aggressive crackdown on, and this is still going on. It just peaked around 2016-17 when this huge Middle Eastern influx, primarily of Syrians, secondarily of Iraqis and Pashtun Afghans, and there were many, many others, fled into Europe in record numbers, unprecedented since the Second World War. And they scrambled at the level of the EU to do interdiction, meaning to prevent people from Syria, later from Libya especially, but from across North Africa ultimately, and from the Middle East, across the Middle East, right, to prevent them from ever even reaching national sovereign territory of Greece, of Italy, and of Spain to a lesser extent, but Greece and Italy were the primary hubs. And the significance of this is it's kind of similar to what the United States does with the Remain in Mexico policy, which may be familiar to UIR students in the American context, right? A lot of what the American Remain in Mexico policy is kind of outsourcing the border control, border patrol, border restrictionism to Mexico and to other bridge societies in Central America, right? So that instead of the United States apprehending people on their territory or close to their territory, you empower Mexico and other countries to do that so that they can never even reach American territory. That's what the EU did at the continental level in 2016-17. And what you see at the bottom of this slide is one of the results of this non-arrival policy, and that is a tremendous spike in drowning. So the Mediterranean and the Aegean are absolutely filled, or were some of the bodies they found. A lot of the bodies, of course, they do not find. So a lot of people are missing at sea, and the statistics are difficult in part to figure out how many people have actually died as a consequence of this policy, because you don't have confirmed deaths always. You sometimes have only suspicions and missing persons who are thought to have drowned, right? And there's a level of certainty that you have to attach to that. But the long story of it is that there is no doubt that these non-arrival policies littered the Mediterranean and the Aegean with thousands upon thousands of refugee corpses. And this is a very serious problem. And this is, you might say, an extreme example of the consequences of non-arrival policies. But there is a system, others are more, you might say, benign, or at least less lethal, less deadly. But there is no doubt that globally, especially the major, most attractive destination societies, such as the United States, such as Australia, such as the EU market and the EU states, and the greater EU sphere, which includes candidate countries in the Balkans, for example, who are made to be a part of the non-arrival policies, right? There is no doubt that those regions have actively for decades been implementing non-arrival policies. And quite apart from them being so, lethal and killing people, they are also, you could argue, violating the spirit of the Refugee Convention and violating the spirit of non-refoulement. So that's why those are very important to think about. The metaphor I like to use for my students is, imagine I say, I believe in your right to faculty consultation. And so I have office hours, except that every time you try to step out your door to come to my office hours, I hired 50 very aggressive looking bodyguards with attack dogs who jump out of the bush and, for example, stop you and, for example, put you in a dungeon somewhere and, for example, try to dissuade you from coming to my office hours and, for example, have a lock in front of the door of the building where it's impossible to enter and have, steel opened, have put metal barriers on my windows and my doors and it's impossible to penetrate to my office. At one point, do you begin to wonder, well, gee, is this guy really interested in delivering on my right to faculty consultation? Or is he perhaps trying to stop me from ever being able to get close to this office? So this is what the modern nation states have done. They're engaging in non-arrival policies, and many of them all the while singing the tune of how dedicated they are to refugee rights. And so perhaps it would be better to say that they're not committed to it, or at least to do it more honestly and say we are not fulfilling the spirit of it. Okay, we can move on to next questions. Maybe I'm going too far.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. We really appreciate hearing your perspective on this. And I think some people have a lot of great questions for you. So right now I'm going to turn it over to some questions and answers from the audience. And then if we have some time later, of course, I'll ask some more, but I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to speak with you. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lydia, now for some questions from the chat. Or if you'd really like to, you're welcome to raise your hand as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mandic.